Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Episode 0, Setting Out. Everything must have a beginning, and this podcast is no different. As we set out, I believe that it is important for you, the listener, to know something about the journey we're about to embark on. You should know why we're setting out, where we hope to go, and what we seek along the way. There should be a sense of the vehicle we will be traveling in, an understanding of the tools we will use, and where we are headed. Finally, you should be aware that there is a destination and what the goal is so that you can assess whether we've arrived at it. You should know a little about your guide. Why have I chosen to set out on this journey, and can you trust me to lead this particular expedition? You should know both my strengths and shortcomings, in so much as these are related to this endeavor. You should also know my biases and predispositions so that you can evaluate the course I have charted and the landmarks I choose to point out along the way. So first, what is this podcast? This podcast is intended to be a discussion of the history and philosophy of science, where the focus is more on how we know what we know instead of just discussing the outcomes of 2.5 millennia of asking and answering questions. Second, why have I set out to undertake such an endeavor? Aren't there already podcasts that talk about science? In my observation, while there are many people who are familiar to a degree with the results of scientific investigation and the technologies that they have produced, such as the ones we're using now, there is often a fundamental lack of awareness of how we got to this place. Such lack of understanding is both unsurprising and, to an extent, a result of the way science is done. In his Connections series, futurist James Burke points out that most of us accept a certain level of technological functionality without ever really understanding its origins or even the amount we depend on it to live. All such technology can be traced back to some observation or work of experimentation. To better understand the world we live in, I believe that it is necessary for us to attempt to know where the technology came from by looking at the science that was done to produce it. Furthermore, as we will discuss in the coming weeks, science is a process that is always moving forward. As discussed by Robert Purington in his excellent work, Physics in the 19th Century, science is continually replacing older, less useful ideas with newer, more accurate ones. Purington writes, quote, "Science, unlike many other intellectual pursuits, proceeds by climbing over the carcasses of its dead, in this case, rejected theories and superseded data. Theories are discarded in favor of those with better predictive power, new tools replace old ones, and the past is rarely revisited. As a result, the history of physics is not part of the education of a physicist, and graduate schools explore only the most recent ideas." Unquote. In other words, as newer versions of scientific ideas eclipse outdated ones, the history of how the work progressed is not as important as the ideas themselves, and thus is often left behind. This forgetfulness is sometimes most pronounced within the scientific community itself, where students are taught only the ideas that are most useful in describing the natural world, while the paths to that knowledge are often neglected. A good example of this is the periodic table of elements. Almost everyone has seen one hanging on a science classroom walls and knows that it can be used in understanding chemistry, but only a few people know where it came from, or what it represents in terms of the progression of scientific knowledge. There can be, as Purington points out in his book, great value in looking back and understanding how science was done in order to better inform our own practice and understanding of scientific inquiry. In our previous example, recognizing that the periodic table is a powerful organizing principle for chemical knowledge can remind us that when we are faced with a large body of information, it is often tremendously helpful to find a way to organize that knowledge in order to guide further investigation. Additionally, while science has been and continues to be done without always considering the nature of the knowledge being produced, there is much to be gained from understanding the work of both philosophers and scientists who, over the centuries, have tried to qualify exactly what makes science a valid and productive intellectual enterprise. It is also useful for us to consider the contexts in which science has been and is done, both culturally and socially. It is clear that the assumptions and practices of scientific inquiry in 15th century Europe, when the philosophical ideas of Aristotle held sway, are in many ways very different than those found 300 years later following the Industrial and French revolutions. Both of these revolutions may be thought to be based, in some sense, on the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, capped by the magnum opus of Isaac Newton, the Principia. In this monumental work, Newton not only creates a new branch of mathematics, correctly describes the causes of motion, and uses those to explain how celestial bodies travel through space, but he also lays out an explanation of how he believes science is to be done that will guide investigators for the next 2 centuries. The goal of this podcast, then, at least initially, is to consider science in a historical context, show how science was done, and why it might have been done that way. One reason this is important is that as scientific inquiry has become a field more often given over to specialists, fewer and fewer members of modern society actively and consciously engage in scientific inquiry in an intentional way. To this trend of specialization can be added the regrettable shift away from truly inquiry-based learning in primary and secondary education, a method where students are taught how science is done by doing it, in favor of learning the results of science in order to do well on standardized assessment tools. Finally, there is the previously mentioned tendency for scientists themselves to be somewhat ahistorical. Add all of this together, and we arrive at a place where many people may know and use the results of scientific inquiry, but few understand how it is done. It is my hope that by considering historical examples of how foundational scientific ideas, such as atomic theory, the theory of plate tectonics, the central role of DNA in encoding and transmitting genetic information, and those kinds of things are arrived at, the listener will gain a deeper understanding and appreciation of science as a process of inquiry and exploration. Next, who should listen to this? Well, everyone, of course. Seriously, the intended audience will be anyone who has finished 10th grade and has had some exposure to the basic ideas of the physical world around them. Advanced or curious younger students may also find what is discussed accessible, though some of the ideas may turn out to be a bit too abstract or require some additional research. The podcast will endeavor to clearly explain all scientific terms and not make many assumptions as to what a person might or might not know. In many cases, since the subject matter will be historical in nature, concepts will be developed from the very first ideas, observations, and experiments held or made by investigators. Additionally, the podcast should be suitable for all sensibilities and will be kept free of any explicit materials. There should be no need for someone to cover someone else's ears or censor the material discussed. It should be noted, however, that this is a podcast on science. This means that there will be no attempt to give equal time to non-scientific ideas, opinions, or such well outside the mainstream of science, or topics broadly considered to be pseudoscientific or outright quackery. As noted astrophysicist and commentator Neil deGrasse Tyson has pointed out, freedom of speech allows people to say any number of things, such as the earth is flat and that the sun revolves around it. But that doesn't mean that such ideas are to be given an equal hearing when they are clearly and plainly incorrect. The ideas represented here will be those of the consensus of the scientific community. When such a consensus has yet to form, or when there are notable divergent scientific opinions that are held to be viable, these will also be discussed. While speculation will be rare, it will be engaged in when appropriate, but will be noted as such with the necessary caveats clearly stated. Fourth question. So who am I, your guide on this podcast? As I said in the introduction, my name is Chad Davies. I grew up wanting to be a scientist, and, like many of my age, my heroes as a kid were the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo astronauts. Going to the moon was still a great adventure in my formative years. In elementary school, I read every single book our little elementary school library had on the U.S. space program. And I even wrote a letter to a publisher to correct a diagram in which they had the wrong picture for one of the rockets. Getting a response back from that publisher thanking me for my correction and promising to make the appropriate changes in the next printing of the book was one of my mom's most treasured memories. So yeah, basically, I'm a nerd from way back. While I'm too young to remember specifically all but the last moon landing, I do remember the Apollo-Soyuz mission, Skylab, and the Viking landers. When I was 13, I watched Carl Sagan's Cosmos, and I have to say, it completely changed my life. I remember being enraptured by his explanation of what I've always been interested in, and I decided by episode 7 I wanted to be an astrophysicist. Moreover, I wanted to be Carl Sagan. I wanted to be a scientist who could teach physics and astronomy, but not just that. I wanted to be the kind of teacher who could put that science into its proper historical context and explain why it was so important that we could do it. To tell you the truth, I still want to be Carl Sagan today. I hope that with this podcast that I can speak with a fraction of his passion and insight. My desire is that the prose here might be a reflection of what I still regard as the best piece of science writing I have ever encountered. At Southern Oregon State College, now Southern Oregon University, after hearing a lecture as a freshman by Dr. Jill Tarter on star formation, I decided that I wanted to figure out how to use computers to simulate those processes. Even though I only had a scant idea of how I would do that, I ended up majoring in physics and computer science and earning the appropriate degrees in both. Interestingly, I also minored in both European history and Western philosophy. From there, I attended the University of Florida for graduate school, where I ended up changing my research interest a bit to the topic of modeling disk galaxies in order to earn my PhD. My dissertation advisor was Dr. James Hunter, and he taught me how to really do science. As much as anything, he taught me the importance and value of skepticism and impressed on me the level of rigor necessary to produce really good results. During my graduate education, I also really saw the big scientific picture as an expression of the fundamental laws of physics. This is probably going to be the biggest bias I'll have to overcome. As a theoretical/computational physicist, I have the tendency to look at the other fields of science as being able to be reduced to the more basic principles of physics. The quote from Ernest Rutherford about all science either being physics or stamp collecting could well describe my approach for a long time. Hopefully, though, I've moved beyond such a limited view, and I'll be able to discuss each field of science from within its own framework and assumptions. Unlike some of my more theoretically inclined colleagues, I've always had a deep appreciation for the experimental work done in science. I was never very good in the lab, so the efforts of the great experimentalists have always amazed me. A good experiment is a well-crafted work of art, both in terms of elegance and creativity, and I hope I can share some of my amazement of those things with you. After finishing graduate school, I took a job at a small 2-year college in Kansas, where I started learning how to teach. It was during my time there that I was first introduced to inquiry-based methods of teaching and learning through the National Science Foundation's TYC 21 program. It's the method I still use as I teach my classes here in Georgia 20 years after receiving my PhD. Looking back, I can't imagine teaching any other way than having my students do the science I want them to learn. In my career, I have taught courses in physics, astronomy, computer science, mathematics, meteorology, chaos theory, and critical thinking. Throughout this time, I have remained interested in history as a hobby, and I continually read books on the history of the subjects I teach and the biographies of the scientists who did the original research. Additionally, I have tried to understand the basic philosophical discussions related to the nature of scientific knowledge and the way in which science is done. I have found these ideas to be very helpful when explaining to my students why what they are doing in some specific activity is important. As we go through this podcast, I think you'll find that I wear my influences on my sleeve, as it were. My thinking has been deeply shaped by a number of other thinkers, and when and where relevant, I'll do my best to point those people out. In an overall sense, some of my biggest influences have been the writings of the aforementioned Carl Sagan and the ideas of James Burke. Their thoughts on science and how it is done have been very instrumental in the formation of my own ideas on the subject. In podcasting, I have been most inspired by 3 shows: Mike Duncan's The History of Rome, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, and the BBC's A History of the World in 100 Objects. While these are certainly not the only podcasts I listen to, nor are they necessarily the best out there, I have found that each of them has fired my imagination and convinced me that it might be possible to do a show that covers this subject matter in a way that is both interesting and engaging. My goal is to be able to approach both the extremely high content quality of those 3 shows as well as their level of professional production. Before leaving this bit on personal information, I would like to give thanks to all the people who have provided encouragement to me when presented with the idea of doing this show. Specifically, my wife Kathy, Janetta Cravens, and Marty Abbott. My intention here is to run each episode by some number of well-informed reviewers with the hope of catching any glaring errors or omissions prior to publishing it to the podcast feed. When I am able to do this, I will be sure to attribute those people their help in the show. While I'm certain that their input will make for a better show, any mistakes are solely my responsibility. Finally, I would be remiss in not thanking Gordon State College and its students for the opportunity to teach many of the ideas that will be covered in this podcast. The preparation, presentation, and subsequent class discussion has gone a long ways towards shaping what I see as important, interesting, and engaging. 5th question: what will the structure of the podcast be? As I have thought about and planned this undertaking, I've considered a lot of ways to go about doing it. One of the most difficult pieces to figure out was how to do the research necessary to create an engaging and accurate piece of work while I'm still doing my day job. In order to do this, I've decided on 2 structures. The first is to do the podcast with episodes and groups of related subject matter. Thus, what you will find coming forth are 4 to 5 episodes that will lay out the basic ideas of what science is, followed by a long series on the history and philosophy involved in the development of modern atomic theory. This will be followed in turn by several episodes related to topics in the philosophy of science that will then be followed by a series on the Copernican revolution. This will continue until I either run out of energy, topics, or hard drive space. And I'm kind of guessing it might be the latter. Using this structure will allow me to concentrate my research on one topic at a time, and that will simplify any number of things. The second structure is that I'll work very hard to get ahead and stay ahead. By the time this podcast is released, I hope to have written and recorded all of the podcasts up through the end of the series on atomic theory. Doing so will allow me the breathing room needed to really dig into the research for the next topics and then write the next series of podcasts with a consistent voice. I can't imagine doing the finishing research for one podcast while trying to do the initial research for a series that's 2 months off and keeping them all straight in my head. We'll call this the prior production plan. Time will tell if I can stick to the schedule. Finally, on the topic of structure, a few nuts and bolts. I'm going to try and put out a 20 to 30 minute episode every week. While I love Dan Carlin's 3 to 4 hour long epic hardcore history episodes, I think most folks will find it easier to digest this information in smaller chunks. Additionally, since I'm going to be trying to follow a narrative historical arc in many of these series, it will be necessary to leave some of the biographical and scientific information out of that narrative. Since I also think that the lives and personalities of the scientists are just as important or interesting as the science being done, and that some of the scientific concepts are just fascinating in their own right, I will occasionally release supplemental episodes into the feed. It is my intention that these episodes will be able to be listened to as standalone pieces. If you choose to listen to the entire main narrative and then go back and pick up the supplements later, that should work just fine. On the other hand, if you choose to listen to a supplement between the narrative episodes, then all the better. One drawback of the approach I have outlined is it eliminates some of the spontaneity I might have to respond to listener questions or feedback. In order to mitigate this somewhat, I will likely also insert a Q&A podcast at the end of various series as needed. This will allow for some communication to take place and, I hope, encourage some of you to get more involved in what we're doing. Questions can be submitted to the podcast website at thescientificodyssey.typepad.com. Another general limitation of this medium is that it's really hard to fully describe some of the ideas and concepts. While I have toyed with the idea of doing a video podcast, I want people to be able to listen to this while driving or riding a bike or doing their laundry. In all of these activities, watching a guy demonstrate something in a video is either difficult or downright dangerous. So instead, I will be posting various links, images, simulations, demonstrations, and all that kind of thing to that website. If you're having a hard time visualizing some idea or apparatus I'm discussing in the podcast, look there and I'll probably have something that will help. If not, leave me a comment or use the handy email link to let me know, and I'll see if I can get something posted that clarifies things. A final note about supporting the podcast financially. I will never ask you to pay a dime to listen to this. I like how Mike Duncan has gone ahead with his podcast, and I think I'd like to follow his model. Maybe down the road, if this thing ever gets to the level of quality I'm striving for, and there's interest among the listeners, I'll post a link for donation, but I expect that's a long ways off. In any case, please don't feel obliged to do anything more than listen and learn. On a related topic, I don't know if this will ever become popular enough for an advertiser to become interested in buying some time, but if it does, I'll keep the intrusions to a minimum. Make sure any ads are both appropriate for the content and audience, and limit them to the beginning and end of the episodes. So, with these thoughts in mind, it's time to set out on our journey of inquiry. Join me for the next 5 episodes as we consider why science is worth understanding for those outside scientific professions, what science is, and how it is commonly done. Until next time, full sails on your journey.